What's up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of Officer Training School. Today we're going to be talking about Recon Element, which is a detachment that I've played like 3 or 4 times ever, but more importantly, I've watched probably 6 to 10 games of Wesley Nemo the Fish St. Hines playing this, so we're going to be talking about some of the things that I've talked to him about, some of my own experience with it, and other things that you can take a look at and where you can find them. I'm doing this one right now because I've been seeing a lot more people talking about it on Reddit, a couple more people just thinking about it a little bit more as they're getting ready for LVO, LGT, and a couple of other different events. So figured I would have an opportunity to talk about it a little bit more now, and maybe we can see if people want to pivot to this, if this is something that they really want to spend their time experimenting with. If you enjoy this kind of content, make sure you throw a like, a subscribe, and a comment down below, all that good stuff. I'm really bad at self-promoting all this kind of stuff, so if this is good, let me know and we'll get more of it. So like I said, when we're talking about Recon, there's a lot of different things in this detachment that makes it very different from the way a lot of other guard lists tend to play, and it also breaks a lot of the different ways that people are used to playing a lot of horde armies. For people who are generally looking for a style of guard where you just have a lot of bodies and you just throw them forward, this kind of does that, but it's not necessarily exactly the way a lot of people who played like conscripts back in the day are used to playing the game. So to start off with some of the basics, Recon Element is a detachment that rewards the fundamentals of 40k really heavily. And one of the things we oftentimes hear from Nemo is that Guard, and Recon especially, is an army that breaks parity. Typically, most armies will have the trade of the back and forth of, I'm going to put something on this objective, and then you have to kill it, and then I'm going to kill the thing that killed my thing. And then we're going to trade back and forth over and over again. But Recon breaks that paradigm in a lot of ways because the damage that it does and the way that it plays around the board don't necessarily play in that just strict back and forth, the trading game that a lot of other armies participate in. Instead, it relies a lot more on understanding the base rules of the game and finding ways to subvert them in order to find advantages. So if you understand how cover works and coherency and swing chargers and objective control and rapid ingress, you're going to have a lot more success with Recon in ways that you won't necessarily be rewarded to the same degree in other detachments. And because of this, the detachment is exponentially skill expressive. I would say that for most average players, you're going to have less success on Recon than you would with Combined Arms or Hammer of the Emperor. And for our better players, it's going to take a little bit of time to get used to exactly what it is that you need to do to make this successful. But being a good Recon player will also help you become a lot better at all of the other things that you can do in Guard and a lot of other armies. The other big thing with Recon is that the damage that it does is really inconsistent and it's short-ranged. So we are going to lose a lot of models, but we are going to score very highly. You need to think of the game in a very different way than killing your opponent most of the time. You are absolutely capable of killing a lot of your opponents, especially if they disrespect the damage that we do, but we are going to score very highly, and it's very difficult for our opponent to actually stop that. So before we go into a little bit more of how to actually play Recon, one of the big questions that I see pretty often, especially on Reddit and from new players, is whether or not Masters of Camouflage, the detachment rule, works in melee. And it does not. The biggest thing that we need to pay attention to when we're looking at this is that benefit of cover is something that applies to a model when it's being targeted for a ranged attack. If we're not being targeted for a ranged attack, benefit of cover simply doesn't exist. And even though the detachment rule says that the models have the benefit of cover, it's more important to recognize that everywhere that benefit of cover is actually defined, it is only in relation to ranged attacks. Also, as a bit of a side note, one of the things that I oftentimes tell people when I'm playing Recon, because they don't need to know the ins and outs of exactly how this works, perhaps the best way to explain it to most other opponents that you're playing against is that you can have double cover. You always have cover, and then if you would normally have cover, you have double cover. And even though this isn't exactly correct, it'll get close enough for most people to understand what's actually happening. If they need a more in-depth explanation, you can go into that it's +1 save is instead of cover, but removing cover with something like a Hellhound or a Flamer does in fact remove both instances of cover. Now let's go ahead and start talking about why this detachment is really good, and it mostly depends on a couple of different things. One, the detachment rule is crazy, and two, these stratagems are also crazy. So in general, if you have a regular guardsman without any orders standing in cover and he's getting attacked with something that doesn't ignore cover, he's going to have a 3-up save. This is 2 better than his 5-up save, which means you take half the damage that you normally would if you were just standing in the open in another detachment. If you also have take cover, this takes all of your guardsmen and takes them from functionally having a 5-up save to effectively having a 1-up save against anything that has AP. And that is an absurd change. You go from having a guardsman that just instantly dies to las cannons and melta-guns, which are some of the highest AP weapons in the game, and suddenly you have a save against that. One of the biggest pieces of math that I always love to talk about is the idea of if you have something that hits on 2s and wounds on 2s, and then you have a 6-up save, you still only have 60% of those attacks actually killing a model. So if someone were to shoot you with 10 melta-guns, you're still going to have 4 guys at the end of it. And 10th edition is an edition where having a single model alive is incredibly important. That one model can keep something from moving forward or backwards because you're still in combat. That one model can do actions and score you points. That one model has a bit better than a 50% chance to pass that battle shock test and score you 5 points. And that one model also standing in the right places means that nothing can come in within 9 inches from normal reserves. So being able to tip the math from having an entire unit of guardsmen die to most of the time you're going to have 1 remaining is a massive difference in the effectiveness of the guardsman unit. And so against shooting armies, we are effectively doubling the durability of a lot of our guardsmen in most situations. So how do we get cover? The natural ways are, of course, standing wholly within a terrain piece or being partially visible because of it. But the other ones that are really important are the Kading Command Squad. Whenever that unit is touching an objective, it gets the benefit of cover, even if it normally wouldn't have it because it's visible. The other one is Go to Ground. Go to Ground gives you the benefit of cover and also 6-up invul save, and when you pair this with a unit that already has Take Cover, you're effectively giving a 2-up save standing in the open. For all of the guard players, just imagine then that a regular Dorn here is not going to kill very many of these guardsmen. It might kill like 10 of them on its own. And one of the common things that you'll hear about Recon is that shooting armies with Ignores cover are really bad for Recon, and on the face of it, this can be true. But there's a couple of things to think about with this at the same time. There are not very many armies in the game that both have Ignores cover shooting and volume shooting. Most Tau lists, which have a lot of Ignores cover, do not have the volume in Kaoyan or Mont Ka to really wipe the number of guardsmen that they need to. There's some units like a Retaliation Cadre Fire Knife unit or Breachers that are being guided that can ignore cover and just kill a bunch of guardsmen with a really high volume of fire. But one of the problems with these are they kill a unit of 10 guardsmen really effectively because that's what we show them, but they're also really easy for us to kill back. And then for many other shooting armies, like in Guard, a Hellhound shooting and then a Dorn shooting is going to kill about 20 guardsmen if they have Take Cover. And that's after you strip their cover. While a lot of Guard armies will be running 2, maybe 3 Rogal Dorns, not very many Guard armies are running that many Dorns and also enough Hellhounds to support all of them. So a lot of these Ignore cover shooting armies simply don't have the volume necessary. So the armies that do have the volume typically don't have the Ignores cover, and the armies that do have Ignores cover typically don't have the volume. Next, let's talk about the enhancements, and the enhancements are not very good in this detachment. They range from kinda bad to just they don't really exist. So the first one, the one that is the most interesting and the one that you would probably take it for its own sake, is tripwires. However, it's pretty inconsistent and it's expensive for the effect that you actually get. Because even if an enemy infantry unit moves within 9 inches of you, it still only goes off on a 4+. While it's pretty impactful when it does go off, that could also have been like 4 or 5 guardsmen, which is also very effective in the game. The other one that is a little bit interesting is Guerrilla Honors. This one is the one that allows you to redeploy a couple of regiment units. But because we are generally taking so many guardsmen and they're basically all starting on the line anyway, we don't really have a lot of room to redeploy them in a meaningful way. And again, it could also just be about 4 more guardsmen. The really bad ones, at least, are very cheap. Scaregrass Grenades has so many different caveats to use, and it's only once per game. It definitely feels like it used to be stronger in their testing, and then they just kept, like, taking out circumstances where you could use it. But now it's also the enhancement that you tend to see the most commonly because it's only 5 points, and it might matter, maybe. The other one feels kind of bad in survival gear because it only gives the Bearer Scout. This can be used on a Castellan in order to let him scout ahead with Kazarkin, and it might have some play if Ogren Bodyguards could have enhancements and then they can scout ahead with a Catachan Command Squad or a Catachan Jungle Fighters unit, but because it can't do either of these things, you don't really ever see this one taken either. Now, let's start talking about the stratagems. The detachment rule is what makes Recon really good into shooting armies, but it's the stratagems that make it have a lot of play into melee armies if you're good enough to use them. The first one, Crack Shots, is pretty situational. It's very good in a small handful of matchups, because the amount of Melta and Plasma shots you're putting out, you've got a decent chance at killing a lot of characters. This is particularly relevant against things like Necrons, where they have a Technomancer leading their Wraiths, or a Dark Commune leading a bunch of Accursed Cultists. However, in most matchups, it's more important to save your CP for other things. Draw Them Out is the detachment defining strat. It is incredibly good anti-melee, and it's also okay in shooting matchups. The primary way that you tend to use Draw Them Out is when an enemy melee unit is moving towards one of the bricks that you care about, you just move 6 inches directly away from them. If they started 1 inch away, and now you move 6 inches away, they now need to roll a 7 in order to make that charge. That's a -6. There are some situations as well where you can use it to move forward in order to move things onto an objective, to deny some different secondaries, but these tend to be more situational, and we'll talk about them later. Another stratagem that is very, very powerful in certain matchups is Scramble Field. You pick an infantry unit, and you just say, nothing is allowed to deep strike within 12 inches of this unit. This is really, really strong against armies like Grey Knights, Genestealer Cults, and Death Shroud Terminators. Armies and units that oftentimes rely on having a lot of things in deep strike, and also oftentimes are using 6-inch deep strike in order to get closer to you than you would initially expect. Another unit that they have a really fun trick on is Gaunt's Ghosts. Gaunt's Ghosts are lone op, and if your opponent has to deep strike 12 inches away, they're not legally allowed to declare a charge into Gaunt's Ghosts. And they're also not allowed to shoot at them either. So you can make Gaunt's Ghost functionally invincible as long as you're pre-measuring all of your opponent's charges. Another one that's pretty useful against shooting armies is Courageous Diversion. A couple of notes on Courageous Diversion. Firstly, it does give the unit that is using the stratagem -1 to be hit against. And as long as that unit is the closest eligible target to your opponent, it also gives -1 to hit for your entire army. Against armies that don't have ignore mods, this can really shift the math quite a bit in terms of how many guys actually live. Remember, when we're playing a game where the last model alive is the most important model, being able to keep one extra model alive by giving them a 6 of Feel No Pain and -1 to hit is going to save units more often than you would expect. The next one, Tanglefoot Grenades, is also a detachment-defining anti-melee strat. When you combine this with Draw Them Out, you can give your opponent a -8 to charge. And if your opponent did not move within 5 inches, if you move 6 inches away and then give them a -2 to charge, they can now no longer make a charge even if they roll a 12. Now, the -2 doesn't sound like a lot initially, but one of the major things to think about is how quickly the math changes, especially in those middle numbers. If your opponent needs to make a 7-inch charge on 2 dice, that's a 60%, or 58 more precisely. But if you give them a -2 and they now need to roll a 9, they are now at a 28%. It's a whole 30% of the time where you're now not taking that charge. It's not quite as impactful on either end of the bell curve because it's already very likely or not very likely to happen, but taking something from more likely to happen to not very likely to happen is a huge deal. The other major thing to think about is if your opponent is coming in for a 9-inch charge out of Deep Strike, if you pop this stratagem as well, it goes from a 9-inch charge to an 11-inch charge. The last stratagem is Scouting Outriders, and it's okay. The biggest use for this one is mostly Rough Riders. In general, if your opponent has a lot of melee threats and a lot of ability to just rush you on the board, you generally want to deploy your Rough Riders on the board to make sure that your opponent, if they full set into you, you have the damage to beat them back. However, if you go first and your opponent can't do that, you now have the option to just put them in reserve and rapid ingress them later on. So altogether, these stratagems combine in order to control a ton of space. Scrambler Fields is really good at shutting down all of your opponent's deep strike, so if your opponent relies on getting 6-inch chargers out of deep strike, or sometimes even less, we have ways to shut that down. Draw Them Out and Tanglefoot Grenades gives any individual unit a -8 to charge the thing that they were trying to charge. And so this makes it really good against armies that rely on 1 or 2 really big bricks to make contact in order to kill you off. So if they're running something like a bunch of Terminators as their way to just run you down, giving that one unit of Terminators -8 to charge is backbreaking. It's not quite as good against armies that have a lot of small stuff. So against armies like Emperor's Children or some variants of World Eaters or Blood Angels, it's a little bit harder because they are going to be running in with 5-man jump pack intercessors or 5-man infractors that are still going to be advancing and charging at you. However, you can still pick and choose and say, I don't want to get charged by that unit. There are also a couple of fun ways to use Draw Them Out in order to move forward. The first one is that Scramble Fields. All of your units already have a 9-inch bubble of your opponent not being able to come in. But if you use Draw Them Out and move forward, and then also pop Scrambler Field, you now have an additional 9 inches. You're effectively pushing back the front line that your opponent could come in from 9 inches away you get an extra 6 and then an extra 3, so you push them 18 inches away, which is well into their own deployment zone. The other one is draw them out in Courageous Diversion. If you just reactively move forward into your opponent and suddenly make their entire army -1 to hit, you're going to save a lot of guys in the back of your army, or at the very least, you're going to force your opponent to shoot a lot more at the one unit that you put directly in front of them, who are going to die anyway. And so this can save a lot of bodies towards the back of your army in ways that they probably weren't expecting. Next, one of the most important things that you need to understand about the game of 40k in general is how swing charges work. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in this video about how swing chargers work. I will be putting a link down in the description to a video by Tactical Tortoise, but there's also videos that you can find by Happy Crumping. It goes by swing charges. I've heard it called orb walking. Slingshot charges are all the same thing, and they're all the same principle of getting a ton of extra movement. But understanding how to use this effectively is one of the major ways in order to play Recon effectively. And the biggest principles to think about here are that every successful charge that you make gives a model that doesn't need to base your opponent at least 8 inches of movement. You roll a 2 on the charge, and then you get a 3-inch pile-in and a 3-inch consolidate. If you add that all together with all the movement possible to a guardsman model in one turn, if you move 9 inches, charge 12 inches, and then pile in and consolidate, you can move a guard model 27 inches in one turn. And those guys can be OC3. This is way more effective with units of 20 than it is with units of 10, because suddenly you have way more ability to swing out using the coherency rules than you would with a unit. This is way more effective with larger units than it is with smaller units, so the more models you have in an individual unit, the farther you can swing out the arm in the orbit. Now, like I said, I'm not going to go super heavy in depth on how this works, but the basic principles you need to understand are that every time a model can move, and is not capable of base-to-basing an opposing model, it simply needs to move closer to either what it is charging or the closest enemy model in a pile-in or consolidate. You do not have to move in a straight line closer. You do not have to move directly towards your opponent. There's a diagram off on the right where if you start 5 inches away and move in kind of a concentric circle to now you are 4.9 inches away, you have succeeded in being closer to your opponent. Now, I know there's a lot of people who play less competitively who says this is cheesy and an unintended consequence of the rules, and I agree. It is probably not the way that Games Workshop had intended for us to play. However, at this point, we are several years into the edition, and it is a well-established way that the game works. So if you're trying to compete, this is something you need to know. How is this used? There's a couple of ways that we really use this. The first one is, like I said, you can swing OC potentially 27 inches in a single turn. You can use this to pile in or consolidate to enemy units so that those units cannot move and they can't shoot what they want. Maybe they're behind a line of sight where they can only shoot into the thing that they are now in combat with. You can use it to stand in front of models that don't have the fly keyword and just say you don't get to move at all. And like we were talking about before, if we reactive move ourselves forward in order to use scramble fields or courageous diversion, we can do that on our turn by effectively using these pile-ins and consolidates in order to swing our army way farther forward than it had any right to be. And this is one of the major reasons why I say Recon Element is an army that incredibly heavily rewards the fundamentals of the game. And if you can understand the value of putting a 25mm base anywhere you want it on the board, such that your opponent cannot move through it, such that your opponent cannot deep strike next to it, such that your opponent has to shoot it, and it has OC, you can play Recon well. The next thing I want to talk about a little bit is there's a very large perception amongst the community that Recon Element doesn't do any damage. And Recon has more damage than you think. It's very high variance. And one of the quotes that I got from Wesley earlier is it's the Melta argument. Melta averages 1.6 damage into most vehicles, but it's never 1.6. It's either 0 or 6. Just like the average family in America is not 2.4 children, you have 2 or you have 3. Some people have 1, some people have 0, but the average is not going to mean a whole lot in this situation. But there are no damage enhancements, there are no damage strats coming out in this army, so we're relying on the raw data sheets. Rough Riders are fairly consistent into targets without invulnerable saves, but they also need to impact their target. And then sometimes, because they don't have any rerolls, sometimes they just don't do the damage that you need them to. So where does the damage come from? It mostly comes from bricks of 20 Cadians with a Cadian Castellan. With first rank fire, second rank fire, you're getting 11 shots of plasma, 2 shots of Melta, and I think it's like 50 shots of lasgun, all with sustained. Against armies like Blood Angels or Orcs, you're going to be killing a ton of models with that plasma and the lasguns. But against vehicles and monsters, the damage is there, it's just inconsistent, because you have to roll 4s into 5s. I've watched Wesley both kill 2 knights in one turn, and also fail to kill 3 custodies. So it's not that Recon doesn't have damage, it's that the damage is short-ranged and the damage is very high variance. So when you build your plans to play Recon against hull spam, you need to build your plans assuming you're not going to be killing as many vehicles as you want, and then be pleasantly surprised when they all disappear. Okay, let's start talking about units that are especially good in Recon Element. I'm a massive Castellan hater. I don't think it's good in Combined. I don't think it's good in Hammer. I think it's maybe okay in Mech Assault, but I think it's really, really good in Recon Element. There's a couple of reasons for this. The first one is, without Castellans, all of your damage is taggable. If your opponent is able to put one guy into a unit of 20 Cadians and doesn't have that guy die to the melee that we're punching back, suddenly that unit of Cadians does not get to shoot. However, in this army, where those bricks are a massive proportion of this army's damage, losing 1/3 of our damage because a Cadian brick got tagged is unacceptable. So having those Castellans to give those units fallback and shoot is huge. The other one is the Cadian Command Squad. It's pretty easy to get cover in 10th edition, but the Cadian Command Squad allows you to be in cover just in the open as long as one of the models in the unit is touching an objective. Now, this is really good because the Cadian Castellan and a Cadian Command Squad can both be attached to the same Cadian Shock Troops unit. And lastly, having lots of OC is really powerful in this. The first reason is, as we touched upon, swing charges are way more effective the more bodies you have in an individual unit. The other reason is it makes orders really efficient. It makes leaders really efficient. Suddenly, the Castellan and the Cadian Command Squad aren't giving their rules to 10 friends, they're giving it to 20 friends. And having one model left in a unit after all is said and done is such a big deal, and having more of those bodies with these great saves ends up being quite a bit. And there are very few units in the game that is going to kill a 26 model unit all in one go. So with all this in mind, I want to take you through a couple of different recon lists that have done well at a couple of different events. There are not a lot of decisions that you get to make if you're trying to play an optimized recon list. You start with Gaunt's Ghost, 3 Castellans, 3 Cadian Command Squads, 20 to 30 Catachan, probably in 10s, but you could do a 20, and then 50 plus Krieg models. Definitely 120, and then 10s after that. That's going to be a lot of your points. But from there, you have a couple of decisions. You have to decide if you want to add more bodies, and just fill it out with more Cadians, more Catachan, more Krieg, and Rough Riders and Death Riders. You can add maybe 1 to 2 tanks, and maybe a Scout Sentinel. The first list that I want to take you through is the one that Wesley Nemo St. Heinz played at Western Wisconsin Wargaming, which was the most recent GT that he's gone to with Recon. And this chooses skew all the way in favor of just having bodies. It's Gaunt's Ghost, Ursula Creed, 3 Cadian Castellans, one of them with Scaregrass Grenades because it costs 5 points, 3 Cadian Command Squads, 4 units of 20 Cadian Shock Troops, 3 units of 10 Catachan Jungle Fighters, 1 unit of 20 Death Corps of Krieg, 5 units of 10 Death Corps of Krieg, 2 units of 10 Attilan Rough Riders, and 1 Scout Sentinel. Now, a couple decisions being made here. Firstly, you have 4 units of 20 Cadians. You only need the 3 of them to make this army effective, but the way that they are typically arranged is you have 3 units of Cadian Shock Troops, all with the Cadian Command Squads. 2 of them also have a Castellan. 1 of them has Ursula Creed, so that you get access to the Master of Vox, so she can send orders much farther. And then you have 1 unit of Cadian Shock Troops with just a Cadian Castellan. That unit typically comes in from reserves and is kind of like a Scion Squad. The 5 units of 10 Death Corps of Krieg, as opposed to more Cadians or more Catachan, is mostly because they have the med pack available to them. In an army that really loves having just a lot of bodies, getting access to rezzing a bunch of them over the course of the game with all of these Death Corps of Krieg is very valuable as well. Now, some other decisions that I've seen Nemo make in other games, I've seen him play units of Death Riders, I've seen him play smaller units of Rough Riders like 1x10 and 2x5, I've seen him play 1 unit of Tempestus Scions just running around. I've seen him play with the Scout Sentinel, I've seen him play without it. But the core is almost identical. It's only a matter of playing around the periphery of what exactly is the most effective way to score. The other example that I want to show you guys, and I'm going to butcher his name, is Nicolas Petit Nico Seguier. And this was played by Nico at the WTC event when he was playing for Team France, where the team overall won the event, and Nico had a great event himself. But it's Gaunt's Ghost, 3 Cadian Castellans, 1 with Scaregas Grenades, another one with Survival Gear, which I don't believe did anything in any of his games. I think he just had the 5 extra points available. 3 Cadian Command Squads, 1 Rogaldorn Commander, 3 units of 20 Cadian Shock Troops, 1 unit of 10 Catachan Jungle Fighters, 1 unit of 20 Catachan Jungle Fighters, 1 unit of 20 Death Corps of Krieg, 4 units of 10 Death Corps of Krieg, 1 unit of 5 Ratlings, and then a Rogaldorn Battle Tank. Now, you'll notice a lot of this is very similar to what we were looking at with Nemo. He's still got the 3 Cadian Castellans, the 3 Cadian Command Squads, the 3 units of 20 Cadian Shock Troops. There's still 30 Catachan, there's still a 20 brick of Death Core of Krieg, 4 units of 10 Death Core of Krieg. However, after that, some of the periphery has changed a little bit. Nico has opted to not have a melee damage package and instead have a tank damage package. The Rogaldorn Commander and the Rogaldorn Battle Tank do put out a decent amount of damage into some of the shootouts that you might otherwise not be able to get to. So against that Starscythe unit that can shoot our recon units from pretty far away, the Rogaldorns will be able to handle that. There are some positives and negatives to making this decision as opposed to just having more guys. The first one is that if your opponent has las cannons and melta guns, suddenly they actually have targets that they want to be shooting them at, whereas those units would be relatively wasted playing up against Wesley's list. The upside is that you can take engagements at ranges that Wesley's list can't. The Rogaldorn with a 72-inch oppressor cannon is going to be able to shoot at vehicles that are going to be doing a lot of damage, like repulsors and some gladiators. The Rogaldorn can duel with those such that they're not putting the same amount of firepower into all of our guardsmen, whereas Wesley would either just have to hide from them or try not to interact with them, or get a swing charge such that he is still in combat with them. But it's not like Nico can't do that. Nico can still try and tag them with these long swing charges with his Catachan or his Death Core of Krieg. Both styles have shown success, and both players are pretty convinced that they have the right idea with the Recon. Either way, they're both very good players, and they both had a ton of success, and if you are willing to put the time into it, you can also have success with this army. Before we close out, though, I do want to bring up a couple of other concerns. One, and I didn't put this one on the slide, Recon is not a cheap army unless you have a 3D printer, and even then it's not that cheap. Even the lower model count armies that you're playing in Recon are still going to be running 150 plus infantry. If you buy that at GW prices, this is one of the most expensive dollar per point armies that you can build. If you don't already have the models to play this, I'm not sure I can really recommend that most people build up the army, the models that you need in order to play this effectively competitively, especially because we don't know how much longer it's going to be around. Another concern is this army takes a lot of time for both you and your opponent to play. We need to move 200 models. Our opponent needs to roll enough attacks to kill 200 models with crazy defenses. And that just simply takes more time than most people tend to realize. It takes a lot of time to play a Horde. It takes even longer to play against the Horde. So I would very much recommend that you get used to playing on a clock and get very good with rolling out all of your attacks. You do need to roll your las guns in a lot of matchups. And ideally, you should be rolling out your las gun attacks every single time you activate the unit. The other major concern is that 40k is more physical than a lot of people realize. For anybody who's played at a GT, you know what I'm talking about, where after 3 games in a day, you are sitting there, your back hurts, your knees hurt, you're feeling dehydrated, and you are tired. A lot of your time in this army is being spent just hunched over a board trying to move around all of your infantry with precision. So if you are interested in trying to play this style of army, make sure you do your stretches, you stay hydrated, wear good shoes, consider wearing a back brace if you need to. But recognize that it's going to be taking a toll both on your cognitive functions throughout the day just because of how much thinking you have to do, and also it's going to be taking a toll on your body throughout the day. So make sure you're keeping yourself in good shape and you're taking care of your body if this is something you're interested in playing. Before I close out this video, I do want to give a big shout out to Wesley St. Hines for helping me figure out a lot of how to play this army and showcase how effective it really can be. If you want to watch him play some games with this, he has had a bunch of games on Tabletop Simulator on the Tactical Tortoise channel, where he recently won their league. I would really recommend going to watch them, especially to help understand how you're supposed to be doing these swing charges in order to tie up your opponent and move your bodies around the board. If you're still watching at this point, and you want to have a chance to talk to Wesley and other top guard players, the password to the Discord is still Rough Riders. If you send me a DM, you can't send it to me here on YouTube. You got to send it to me on Discord or Reddit. I will send you an invite to the Discord there. The other way to do it is, of course, become a channel member. You just need to do it the one time, and then you have access to the Discord for forever. But for now, this has been Josh with Joushi Howard. We've been talking about Recon Element, and we'll see you guys all next time. Bye-bye.